The words hit me like ice water through my veins as I lay perfectly still in that sterile hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors masking the sound of my daughter's hushed conversation just outside my room. The doctors said she might not have much time left, Claire whispered to someone on the phone, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound devastated, but was really calculating. We need to discuss the trust fund situation before it's too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had been admitted to St. Mary's Hospital 3 days earlier for what the emergency room doctor called severe dehydration and confusion, though I knew exactly what day it was, what year it was, and most importantly what my children were really after. My body might have been weak, but my mind had never been sharper. My name is Bertha Coleman, and at 73 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of human nature. I was wrong. The lesson I was about to learn would cost me my illusions about family, but would ultimately save me from a fate worse than death, being robbed blind by my own flesh and blood while they smiled and called it love. The morning everything began to unravel started like most others in my quiet 2-story home on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I had lived in this house for 42 years, ever since my late husband Frank and I moved here, when Claire was just 8 and her younger brother Marcus was 5. The mortgage had been paid off for over a decade, the garden was mature and thriving, and every room held memories that money couldn't buy. This wasn't just a house, it was the archive of our family's happiness, built with Frank's carpenter hands, and filled with my cooking, our children's laughter, and decades of ordinary moments that had shaped us all. Frank had been gone for 6 years now, taken by a heart attack that came as suddenly as a summer storm. Those first months without him nearly broke me, but I had found my rhythm again. I woke each morning at 6:30, made myself a proper breakfast with fresh orange juice, tended to my rose garden that Frank had planted for our 20th anniversary, and spent my afternoons reading mystery novels or working on the quilts I donated to the church fundraiser every Christmas. My life was quiet but purposeful, structured but not rigid. I had my health, my independence, and a trust fund that Frank had established years ago to ensure I would never want for anything. The trust fund was Frank's greatest gift to me after 47 years of marriage. He had worked as a union electrician his entire career, but he had also been blessed with an eye for good investments and the discipline to save every extra penny. What started as a modest nest egg had grown over the decades into something substantial, not wealthy by magazine standards, but more than enough to guarantee my comfort for the rest of my life and leave something meaningful for Claire and Marcus when my time came. Frank had structured it carefully with his lawyer, ensuring that I controlled everything while I lived, with the remainder passing to our children only after my death. It wasn't about the money itself, it was about security, about knowing that the woman he loved would never be dependent on anyone else's charity. Claire lived 40 minutes away in the suburb of Westfield with her husband Derek and their twin boys Jacob and Nathan, who were now 15 and more interested in video games than visiting their grandmother. She worked as a real estate agent for one of the larger firms in the area, and from what I gathered during our increasingly infrequent phone calls, business had been challenging lately. The housing market had shifted, interest rates had climbed, and she complained often about clients who looked at dozens of properties but never committed to buying. Derek worked in middle management at an insurance company, the kind of job that came with a decent salary but also the constant anxiety of corporate restructuring and layoff. Marcus had moved even further away after college, settling in Phoenix with his wife Angela and their daughter Sophie, who was now 12. He worked in information technology for a healthcare company, a field I didn't pretend to understand but one that seemed to pay well enough for them to live in a house with a swimming pool and take vacations to places like Hawaii and Costa Rica. Unlike Claire, Marcus called regularly and always seemed genuinely interested in how I was feeling, what I was reading, whether I needed anything fixed around the house. His visits were less frequent due to the distance, but when he came to Iowa he stayed for several days and made an effort to spend real time with me, not just checking off a duty. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came on a Tuesday in late September. I had been feeling slightly under the weather for a few days, nothing dramatic, just a persistent headache and some dizziness when I stood up too quickly. At my age, These minor ailments were hardly unusual, and I had planned to mention them to Dr. Hoffman at my next scheduled appointment in 2 weeks. But when Claire called that afternoon to check in, her reaction to my casual mention of not feeling quite myself was immediate and intense. "Mom, you can't just ignore symptoms like that," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge it got when she was worried or frustrated. "Dizziness at your age could be anything: blood pressure, medication interactions, even a stroke warning. You need to be seen by a doctor immediately." I tried to reassure her that I was probably just fighting off a cold, that I had been drinking plenty of fluids and planned to rest more, but she would hear none of it. Within an hour, she was at my front door with Derek, both of them insisting that I needed to go to the emergency room right away. The urgency in their voices was convincing, and I had always trusted Claire's judgment when it came to medical matters. She had been a nursing student briefly in college before switching to business, and she often spoke with authority about health issues. "We're not taking any chances," Derek said as he helped me gather a small overnight bag, just in case they wanted to keep me for observation. "Better safe than sorry, especially when you live alone." The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was exactly what I expected: bright fluorescent lights, hard plastic chairs, and the particular smell of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odors of human distress. We waited for 3 hours before I was called back to see a doctor, a young woman who looked barely older than my grandsons, but who examined me thoroughly and asked detailed questions about my symptoms, my medications, and my medical history. Blood was drawn, an IV was started, and I was given what she called a full workup to rule out anything serious. The test results, when they came back several hours later, were largely normal. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, probably due to the stress of being in the hospital, and I was indeed somewhat dehydrated, but nothing that couldn't be corrected with rest and increased fluid intake. The doctor recommended that I stay overnight for observation and rehydration therapy, more as a precaution than a necessity, but both Claire and Derek insisted it was the wise thing to do. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," Claire said as she helped me get settled in the hospital bed they assigned me on the medical floor. "Living alone in that big house, trying to maintain the garden by yourself, never asking for help, maybe this is your body's way of telling you to slow down." I wanted to point out that I had been living quite comfortably on my own for 6 years without any major health scares, that I had a cleaning service come twice a month and a landscaper who helped with the heavier garden work, but something in her tone made me hesitate. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify, a sense that this conversation was about more than my immediate health. Derek stayed for another hour, making small talk about the boys' school activities and his work, but I could sense his impatience to leave. Claire, however, seemed determined to linger. She fussed with my blankets, adjusted the height of my bed, and kept asking if I needed anything from home. It was only when the evening nurse came in to check my vital signs and suggested that visiting hours would be ending soon, that she finally gathered her purse and coat. "I'll be back first thing in the morning," she promised, kissing my forehead in a way that felt both familiar and somehow performative. "Try to get some rest and don't hesitate to call the nurses if you need anything at all." After they left, I lay in the narrow hospital bed listening to the sounds of the corridor outside my room, the soft squeak of nursing shoes on linoleum, the distant murmur of conversations at the nurses' station, the occasional beep or alarm from other rooms. The IV drip in my arm was cool and slightly uncomfortable, but I felt more alert than I had in days. Perhaps the fluids were already helping, or perhaps it was simply the change of environment, but my mind felt clear and focused in a way it hadn't for weeks. That night I found myself thinking about Frank and the conversations we used to have about our children, particularly Claire. He had always worried that she was too focused on material things, too quick to see problems in terms of what they would cost rather than how they could be solved. "She's got a good heart," he would say, "but she thinks money is the answer to everything." Marcus, on the other hand, had inherited Frank's more philosophical approach to life. He worked hard and provided well for his family, but he also understood that the most important things, health, relationships, experiences, couldn't be purchased. I had always defended Claire when Frank expressed these concerns, pointing out that her focus on financial security came from a place of caring, that she wanted to be sure we were all protected and provided for. But lying there in that hospital bed, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I began to wonder if Frank's instincts had been more accurate than I had wanted to admit. The next morning brought a parade of medical professionals. Hoffman, my regular physician, who had been called in to consult the young emergency room doctor from the night before, a cardiologist who wanted to run an EKG just to be thorough, and a hospital social worker who introduced herself as Miss Patterson and explained that she routinely checked in with older patients to discuss their living situations and support systems. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. My vital signs were stable, my test results were reassuring, and there was no medical reason I couldn't go home that afternoon. But each professional also seemed to emphasize the importance of having adequate support at home, of not overexerting myself, of recognizing when I might need help with daily activities. Living alone can be challenging at any age, Miss Patterson said as she sat in the chair beside my bed, a clipboard balanced on her lap. Do you have family nearby who can check on you regularly? Someone who could stay with you for a few days while you recover? I assured her that I was quite capable of taking care of myself, that I had been doing so successfully for years, but she persisted with questions about my daily routine, my social connections, my plans for aging and play. It felt less like a medical consultation, and more like an assessment, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what I was being assessed for. Claire arrived just as Mrs. Patterson was finishing her questions, and I noticed the two women exchange a meaningful look before the social worker excused herself. Claire immediately took the chair Mrs. Patterson had vacated, and leaned forward with the intense expression she wore when she was about to deliver important news. Mom, I've been thinking about last night, she began, and I'm really concerned about you living alone in that house. What if something more serious had happened and no one was there to help you? What if you had fallen, or had a real medical emergency? I started to remind her that I had a medical alert system that Frank had insisted I wear, that I had neighbors who checked on me regularly, that I was hardly isolated or helpless, but she continued before I could speak. Derek and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some alternatives. Nothing drastic, she added quickly, seeing the expression on my face, but maybe looking into some senior living communities where you'd have more support, where someone would be available if you needed help. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Senior living community. The euphemism was clear enough. She was talking about moving me into some kind of assisted living facility, about taking me away from the home Frank and I had built together, the garden we had planted, the life I had carefully constructed and maintained. Claire, I appreciate your concern, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, but I'm not ready for that kind of change. This was a minor incident, nothing more. Dr. Hoffman says I can go home today. She nodded, but I could see she wasn't convinced. I know you love the house, Mom, and I'm not saying it has to happen immediately, but we need to start thinking about these things. You're not getting any younger, and living alone in a house that size isn't practical forever. The word practical stuck with me long after she left to handle the discharge paperwork. Practical for whom? My house wasn't just practical for me, it was perfect. It was sized right for my needs, familiar in every corner, filled with everything that mattered to me. The only thing impractical about it was that it represented an asset that Claire couldn't access as long as I was living independently in it. That afternoon, as Derek drove me home from the hospital, I found myself looking at my house with new eyes. The white wooden siding that Frank had painted just 2 years before his death still looked fresh and clean. The front porch with its hanging baskets of late-season flowers was welcoming and well-maintained. The lawn was green and recently mowed by the service I employed. This wasn't the home of someone who was failing or unable to care for herself. It was the home of someone who had built a life and intended to keep living it. But as Derek helped carry my small overnight bag to the front door, I noticed him looking around with what seemed like an appraiser's taking in the crown molding in the foyer, the hardwood floors that Frank had refinished himself, the solid construction that had made this house a wise investment 4 decades ago. This really is a beautiful place, he said as we walked through to the kitchen. These older homes have so much character. They don't build them like this anymore. Something in his tone made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite identify why. It was the way he might have spoken about a house he was considering purchasing, not the way someone typically commented on their mother-in-law's longtime family home. Claire had promised to stop by that evening with groceries and to make sure I was settling in comfortably, but when she arrived, she wasn't alone. Marcus was with her, having apparently flown in that morning after she called him about my hospital stay. I was surprised to see him, pleased, certainly, but surprised that he had made such a rushed trip for what had turned out to be such a minor medical issue. "Mom," he said, wrapping me in one of his warm, genuine hugs. "Claire made it sound like you were at death's door. You look great." I laughed, feeling more like myself than I had in days. "Your sister has always been prone to dramatics. The doctor said I was just a little dehydrated and needed some rest." But as the evening progressed, I began to notice that both of my children seemed unusually interested in discussing my daily routine, my health management, my long-term plans. The conversation kept circling back to themes of safety, security, and the challenges of aging alone. They asked about my finances in ways that seemed more pointed than usual, whether I was keeping up with property taxes, whether the house maintenance was becoming too expensive, whether I had thought about simplifying my life. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of," Marcus said when I finally asked directly what had prompted all these questions. "You're the most important thing in the world to us, and we want to be sure we're doing everything we can to support you." It was exactly the right thing to say, and Marcus said it with what seemed like complete sincerity, but something nagged at me as I lay in my own bed that night, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my own home. The concern felt real, but it also felt oddly urgent for children whose mother had just had a routine overnight hospital stay with a completely benign outcome. Over the following weeks, both Claire and Marcus seemed to find reasons to call more frequently than usual. Claire started dropping by unannounced, always with some excuse. She was in the neighborhood showing a property, she had picked up extra groceries, she wanted to check on how I was recovering. Marcus extended his visit by several days, working remotely from my dining room table, and insisting that he wanted to spend more time with me. At first I welcomed the increased attention. It had been years since I felt so central to my children's lives, so important to their daily thoughts. But gradually I began to notice patterns that made me uncomfortable. They seemed to be taking inventory of my belongings, asking casual questions about items that Frank had collected or inherited, discussing the upkeep of the house in ways that suggested they saw it as a burden rather than a home. Claire in particular seemed fascinated by Frank's gun collection, which was stored in a locked cabinet in his old workshop in the basement. These were hunting rifles and antique pieces that he had acquired over the years, nothing particularly valuable but well maintained and properly registered. She asked several times whether I felt safe having them in the house, whether I knew how to secure them properly, whether I had considered selling them since I certainly had no use for firearms. "It just seems like an unnecessary risk," she said one afternoon, as we sat in the kitchen sharing tea and store-bought cookies. "If someone broke in and found those guns, it could be dangerous, and honestly they're probably worth something. You could get a nice little sum for them, and eliminate a worry at the same time." I reminded her that the gun cabinet was securely locked, that Frank had always been meticulous about firearm safety, and that the collection held sentimental value as a connection to his memory. But she persisted, suggesting that sentiment was fine but practicality had to come first. Marcus took a different approach. Instead of focusing on individual items, he seemed more interested in the big picture, the cost of maintaining the property, the expense of utilities for such a large space, the burden of property taxes and homeowners insurance. He never suggested directly that I should move, but he often commented on how much simpler life could be in a smaller space, how nice it might be to have fewer responsibilities, and more freedom to travel or pursue hobbies. "You've worked hard your whole life, Mom," he said one evening as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset. "Maybe it's time to let someone else handle the maintenance and the worries. You could live anywhere you wanted, do anything you wanted, without being tied down to all The phrase tied down stuck with me. I had never felt tied down by my home, quite the opposite. It was the place where I felt most free, most myself, most connected to the life Frank and I had built together. But I was beginning to understand that my children saw it differently. To them, the house wasn't my sanctuary, it was my prison, and they were positioning themselves as the loving children who wanted to help me escape. The breakthrough moment came on a Thursday evening in mid-October. Marcus had finally returned to Phoenix, but Claire had gotten into the habit of stopping by most evenings after work, usually with some small offering, take-out dinner, a magazine she thought I'd enjoy, flowers from the grocery store. On this particular evening she arrived with Chinese food and a bottle of wine, suggesting we have a cozy dinner together. The meal was pleasant enough, though I noticed Claire seemed unusually chatty, talking rapidly about her work, her clients, the challenges of the real estate market. She poured herself several glasses of wine, and encouraged me to do the same, though I rarely drank more than one glass, and never on an empty stomach. As the evening progressed, she became more relaxed, more unguarded, and eventually more honest than I had seen her in years. "You know, Mom," she said, as we finished the last of the Kung Pao chicken, "I've been thinking a lot about your situation since your hospital stay, about what's best for you, what's best for all of us." Something in her tone made me pay closer attention. This wasn't the beginning of another gentle suggestion about senior living. This was the start of a more serious conversation. "Derek and I have been looking at some numbers," she continued, "and the truth is, maintaining this house is going to get more and more expensive as you get older. Property taxes go up every year, maintenance costs are only going to increase, and if you ever need any kind of home care or medical support, the expenses could get out of hand really quickly." I nodded, unsure where this was leading, but sensing that Claire had rehearsed this conversation. "The thing is," she said, leaning forward slightly, "if something happened to you, I mean when something eventually happens to you, Marcus and I are going to inherit a lot of responsibility along with the house and the trust fund. We'll have to deal with selling the property, managing the estate, handling all the legal and financial details. And honestly, it might be easier for everyone if some of those transitions happened while you're still here to guide the process." There it was. The conversation I had sensed building for weeks had finally arrived. Claire wasn't talking about my comfort or my safety, she was talking about inheritance management, about making the eventual transfer of assets as convenient as possible for her and Mark. The trust fund that Frank had established to ensure my security was being discussed as if it were already theirs, as if my death were an event to be planned for rather than a distant possibility to be ignored. "I see," I said carefully, not trusting myself to say more. "It's not that we want you to do anything you're not comfortable with," Claire continued, her words slightly slurred from the wine. "But maybe we could start thinking about some changes that would benefit everyone. Maybe moving to a nice assisted living place, where you'd have help when you need it. Maybe putting the house on the market while the real estate market is still strong. Maybe even restructuring the trust fund so that some of the money could be accessed now, when it could help with living expenses and transitions." The last suggestion took my breath away. Restructuring the trust fund meant changing the legal arrangements Frank had so carefully established, potentially giving Claire and Marcus access to money that was intended to support me for the rest of my life. It meant dismantling the financial security that had allowed me to live independently and with dignity. "Those are significant suggestions," I said finally. "They would involve major changes to arrangements your father spent years putting in place." Claire nodded enthusiastically, apparently encouraged that I wasn't dismissing her ideas outright. "Exactly, but Dad set those things up years ago, when circumstances were different. He couldn't have anticipated how much healthcare costs have gone up, or how complicated it's become to maintain a property like this. If he were here now, he'd probably want to adjust things based on current realities." It was a clever argument, using Frank's memory to justify undoing his work. But I knew Frank better than anyone, and I knew that his primary concern had always been ensuring that I would never be dependent on anyone else's generosity or convenience. The trust fund wasn't designed to be flexible or accessible to anyone but me. It was designed to be a fortress protecting my independence until the day I died. That night, after Claire left with promises to start researching some options for assisted living facilities and estate planning attorneys, I sat in Frank's old recliner in the living room and tried to process what I had learned. My children, whom I loved unconditionally and had sacrificed for throughout their lives, were actively planning for my decline and death in ways that prioritized their convenience over my autonomy. They weren't necessarily malicious. I could see that they had convinced themselves they were acting in my best interests, but they were treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The most disturbing realization was that Claire had been building toward this conversation for weeks, possibly months. The increased phone calls, the unannounced visits, the questions about my daily routine and my belongings, it had all been research information gathering to support the case she had just presented. Even my hospital stay had been weaponized, turned into evidence that I was no longer capable of living independently, despite the fact that the medical professionals had found nothing seriously wrong with me. I thought about Frank and what he would have advised in this situation. He had always been direct in his approach to problems, preferring honest confrontation to passive manipulation. But he had also been strategic, careful to gather all the facts before making important decisions. "Knowledge is power," he used to say when he was researching an investment or planning a major purchase. "The more you know, the better decisions you can make." That night, I began my own research project. If Claire and Marcus were planning my future without my input, I needed to understand exactly what they were planning and what legal rights I had to resist their suggestion. I needed to know what Frank had actually established in the trust fund, what protections he had built in, and what would be required to change any of the arrangements. The next morning, I called the law firm that had handled Frank's estate planning, a small but well-regarded practice that had been serving families in Cedar Falls for over 30 years. Frank's original attorney had retired, but his junior partner, a woman named Margaret Henley, had taken over most of his client files and was familiar with our family's legal affairs. "Mrs. Coleman," she said when I was transferred to her office, "it's good to hear from you. I hope everything is going well." I explained that I wanted to review the trust fund documentation to make sure I understood all the terms and provisions Frank had established. I didn't mention Claire's suggestions about restructuring, not yet, but I wanted to understand my legal position before I decided how to respond. "Of course," Margaret said. "That's very wise. Many people don't fully understand the documents they sign, and it's important to be clear about your rights and options. Why don't you come in next week and we'll go through everything together?" The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I spent the intervening days thinking carefully about what questions I wanted to ask and what concerns I wanted to address. So, I also found myself paying closer attention to Claire's phone calls and visits, listening not just to what she said, but to how she said it, looking for clues about what she might be planning. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Claire had begun treating my property as if it were already hers to manage, commenting on maintenance issues that needed to be addressed, suggesting improvements that would increase the home's resale value, and asking detailed questions about my monthly expenses and financial obligations. She never directly claimed authority over these decisions, but she spoke as if it were natural and expected that she would be involved in making them. When I mentioned that I had scheduled an appointment with Margaret Henley to review my legal documents, Claire's reaction was immediate and intense. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp with what sounded like alarm. "Is something wrong? Are you having problems with the trust fund?" I assured her that everything was fine, that I simply wanted to make sure I understood all the provisions Frank had established, but she pressed for more detail. "I could come with you," she offered. "I mean, if you're going to be making any changes or updates, it might be helpful to have someone there to ask questions you might not think of." The suggestion that I might not be capable of asking appropriate questions on my own was both insulting and revealing. Claire clearly wanted to be present for any discussions about the trust fund, wanted to influence any decisions I might make about my own financial affairs. "That's kind of you," I said, "but I think I can handle a simple review meeting on my own." Her face tightened with what looked like frustration, but she didn't push further. Instead, she changed the subject to other matters: the weather, her work, the boys' school activity. But I could sense her mind working, calculating, planning her next approach. That evening, Marcus called from Phoenix. It was unusual for him to call during the week, and the conversation felt oddly similar to my exchange with Claire that afternoon. "Claire mentioned your meeting with an attorney. he said after we had exchanged the usual pleasantries about health and weather. Is everything okay? Do you need help with something? Again, I explained that I was simply reviewing documents, making sure I understood my financial situation, and again, I was offered assistance. I could fly out for the meeting, Marcus said. I mean, legal stuff can be pretty complicated, and it might be helpful to have someone there to take notes or ask follow-up questions. The coordination between my children was obvious and concerning. They had clearly discussed my appointment with Margaret Henley, and they were both eager to be involved in any conversations about my financial affairs. The trust fund that Frank had established to protect my independence was apparently being viewed by my children as a joint asset they had a right to monitor and influence. I appreciate the offer, I told Marcus, but I'm quite capable of handling my own legal affairs. There was a pause before he responded, and when he did, his tone was careful and measured. Of course you are, Mom. We just want to make sure you have all the support you need. Sometimes these legal documents can be confusing, and we don't want you to be taken advantage of or to miss something important. The implication that I might be taken advantage of by my own attorney, or that I might be too confused to understand my own financial documents, was both patronizing and strategic. My children were positioning themselves as my protectors, while simultaneously undermining my confidence in my own judgment and competence. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen, looking out at the garden Frank had planted for me, thinking about the conversations I had just had with both of my children. They loved me, I didn't doubt that, but they also saw me as an obstacle to their own financial security, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The trust fund Frank had created to ensure my dignity in old age was being viewed by Claire and Marcus as their inheritance, delayed only by the inconvenience of my continued existence. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, with the first hard frost of the season covering my rose bushes and turning the grass silver in the early light. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Margaret Henley, choosing a navy blue suit that Frank had always said made me look both professional and approachable. I wanted to be taken seriously, but I also wanted to project the competence and clarity that my children seemed to doubt I still possessed. Margaret's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown with high ceilings, original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves lined with legal volumes. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had little patience for nonsense. Frank had always spoken highly of her intelligence and integrity, and sitting across from her desk, I could see why he had trusted her with important legal matters. Miss Coleman, she said as she opened a thick file folder, I have all of your husband's documents here, including the trust fund he established in Would you like me to walk you through the key provisions? For the next hour, Margaret explained in clear, simple language exactly what Frank had created, and why. The trust fund was what she called irrevocable, meaning that the terms couldn't be changed without the consent of all beneficiaries and a court order demonstrating compelling circumstances. During my lifetime, I had complete control over all distributions and decisions. Upon my death, the remaining assets would be divided equally between Claire and Marcus, but only after specific charitable donations Frank had designated were made. Your husband was very thorough, Margaret said as she showed me the relevant pages of documentation. He wanted to ensure that you would have financial security and independence for the rest of your life, regardless of changing circumstance. He also included provisions that would prevent anyone from pressuring you to make distributions or changes you weren't comfortable with. She pointed to a particular clause that Frank had insisted upon, something called a duress provision, that would invalidate any changes made to the trust under pressure from beneficiaries or their representatives. It was as if Frank had anticipated exactly the situation I was now facing, and had built legal protections into the documents to prevent it. Has anyone suggested that you consider modifying these arrangements? Margaret asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with professional interest. I hesitated for a moment, then decided that honesty was the best approach. I described Claire's suggestions about restructuring the trust fund, about moving to assisted living, about simplifying my life by liquidating assets. I explained the increasing pressure I felt from both children to make major changes to arrangements that had served me well for years. Margaret listened without interruption, taking occasional notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a moment, before responding. "Mrs. Coleman," she said finally, "what you're describing sounds like what we call financial elder abuse. It doesn't have to involve outright theft or fraud. It can include pressure to make financial decisions that benefit others at your expense, or attempts to gain premature access to assets through manipulation or coercion." The words hit me like a physical blow. Financial elder abuse. I had never thought of my children's behavior in those terms, had never imagined that their concern for my welfare might actually constitute a form of abuse. But hearing Margaret's professional assessment, I realized that was exactly what had been happening. "What Frank created here," Margaret continued, "was specifically designed to prevent this kind of situation. He was very clear that he wanted you to maintain complete control over your finances and your living situation for as long as you were mentally competent. And based on our conversation today, you are clearly competent to make your own decision." She explained that my children had no legal right to pressure me into changing the trust fund, no standing to demand modifications to arrangements I was satisfied with, and no authority to make decisions about my living situation or my property. The trust fund belonged to me completely during my lifetime, and any attempts to gain premature access to it could potentially constitute fraud or attempted theft. "What should I do?" I asked, feeling both relieved to understand my legal position and overwhelmed by the implications of what I had learned. Margaret's advice was both practical and empowering. First, she recommended that I document any future attempts by Claire or Marcus to pressure me into making financial or living arrangement changes. Second, she suggested that I consider updating my power of attorney documents to ensure that only someone I completely trusted would have authority to make decisions on my behalf if I ever became incapacitated. Third, she offered to communicate directly with my children if necessary, explaining the legal provisions Frank had established, and making clear that any attempts to circumvent them would have serious legal consequences. "The most important thing," she said as our meeting concluded, "is that you understand your rights and feel empowered to exercise them. Your husband went to great lengths to protect your independence and dignity. Don't let anyone take that away from you, even if they claim to be acting out of love." I left Margaret's office feeling both stronger and more vulnerable than I had in months. Stronger because I now understood that Frank had given me powerful legal tools to protect myself, and that I had professional support in using them. More vulnerable because I had to accept the painful reality that my own children were willing to manipulate and pressure me in pursuit of their own financial interests. The weeks following my meeting with Margaret Henley brought a clarity I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. Armed with knowledge of my legal protections, I began to see my children's behavior through an entirely different lens. What I had initially interpreted as loving concern now revealed itself as calculated manipulation, each conversation strategically designed to undermine my confidence and prepare me for decisions that would benefit them far more than me. The shift in my perspective was gradual but profound. I started keeping a small notebook where I recorded the details of every interaction with Claire and Marcus, noting not just what they said but how they said it, what questions they asked, and what assumptions they seemed to be making about my future. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency and sophistication. Claire had developed a particular talent for introducing her suggestions as if they were my own idea. During our phone conversations, she would plant seeds of doubt about my living situation, then circle back days later to ask if I had given any more thought to the concerns I had expressed. She never directly stated that I was becoming incompetent or unsafe living alone, but she constantly referenced news stories about elderly people who had fallen or become victims of scams, always with the implication that these cautionary tales were relevant to my situation. Marcus took a more analytical approach, focusing on the financial implications of my current lifestyle. He would call with questions about my monthly expenses, my property taxes, my utility bills, always framing these inquiries as attempts to help me budget more effectively or identify potential savings. But I began to notice that he was building a comprehensive picture of my financial obligations, information that would be extremely useful if he were planning to argue that my expenses were becoming unmanageable. The most insidious aspect of their campaign was how they had begun to reframe Frank's memory and intention. Claire, in particular, had started making comments about how Frank would have wanted me to be practical about my situation, how he would have prioritized my safety and comfort over sentimental attachments to the house or the garden. She spoke as if she had intimate knowledge of Frank's wishes, despite the fact that he had spent considerable time and money establishing legal documents that directly contradicted everything she was suggesting. The breakthrough moment came on a cold November evening when Claire arrived unannounced with takeout dinner and what she called some information she thought I should see. She spread several brochures across my kitchen table, each one advertising a different senior living community in the area. The facilities ranged from independent living apartments to full-service assisted living, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were expensive, they required substantial entrance fees, and they would necessitate selling my home to finance the transition. "I've been doing some research," Claire said as she opened containers of Thai food, "and I think you'd be amazed at what's available now for seniors. These places aren't like the old nursing homes we used to imagine. They're more like resorts with activities and social opportunities and healthcare right on site." I picked up one of the brochures, studying the glossy photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in various activities, water aerobics, card games, group dining. The images were professionally shot and carefully staged, designed to convey independence and vitality while subtly emphasizing the security and supervision these facilities provided. "This one," Claire said, pointing to a brochure for a place called Sunset Manor, "has a waiting list because it's so popular, but I spoke with their admissions coordinator and they're expecting some openings in the spring. The entrance fee is substantial, but when you factor in what you'd get from selling the house, plus the monthly distributions from the trust fund, it would actually be quite manageable." The casual reference to monthly distributions from the trust fund caught my attention immediately. Claire was speaking as if these distributions were a given, as if the trust fund existed to finance whatever living arrangements she deemed appropriate for me. But Margaret Henley had been very clear that I controlled all distributions from the trust fund, that I could choose to take nothing or everything depending on my needs and preferences. "How much is the entrance fee?" I asked, studying the fine print at the bottom of the Sunset Manor brochure. Claire hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's significant, about $300,000, but that's a one-time payment that secures your place permanently. And honestly, when you consider what you'd save on property taxes, utilities, maintenance, and all the other costs of keeping up this house, it might actually save money in the long run." $300,000. The amount was staggering, representing a substantial portion of the total assets Frank had accumulated over a lifetime of careful saving and investing. And Claire was discussing it as if it were simply a matter of moving money from one account to another, as if the trust fund existed for the purpose of financing whatever lifestyle changes she thought were appropriate. "Have you discussed this with the trust fund administrator?" I asked, curious to see how Claire would respond to a direct question about the legal requirements for such a large distribution. She looked confused for a moment. "What do you mean? I thought you controlled the trust fund." "I do," I said carefully. "But there are specific procedures for large distributions, documentation requirements, approval processes. It's not as simple as writing a check." This was not entirely true. Margaret Henley had explained that I could request distributions of any amount at any time, subject only to my own judgment about necessity and appropriate. But I wanted to see how Claire would react to the suggestion that accessing the trust fund might be more complicated than she had assumed. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of frustration quickly replaced by renewed enthusiasm. "Well, I'm sure whatever paperwork is required, we can handle it. The important thing is finding the right place for you, somewhere you'll be safe and happy." The conversation continued for another hour, with Claire walking me through the features and benefits of each facility she had researched. She had clearly invested significant time and effort in this project, gathering detailed information about costs, services, and availability. But what struck me most was her assumption that I would be grateful for her initiative, that I would see her research as evidence of her love and concern rather than an attempt to control my future. After she left that evening, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the glossy brochures, trying to process what I had learned. Claire wasn't just suggesting that I consider senior living, she had already begun the process of selecting and evaluating specific facilities. She had spoken with admissions coordinators, gathered financial information, and apparently even discussed my situation with Derek in enough detail that they had developed what amounted to a business plan for relocating me. The most disturbing aspect of her presentation was how she had framed the entire discussion in terms of what was best for me, what would make me happier and safer, what Frank would have wanted. She had appropriated not only my husband's memory but my own autonomy, speaking as if she were uniquely qualified to determine what my needs and preferences should be. That night, I called Marcus in Phoenix. It was late in Iowa but still early evening in Arizona, and he answered on the second ring with his usual warmth and energy. "Mom, how are you feeling?" Claire said she was coming by tonight with some information about living options. The coordination between my children was immediate and obvious. Claire had informed Marcus about her visit before it happened, had probably briefed him on her strategy and her objectives. They were working together, presenting a united front in their campaign to convince me that major life changes were necessary and inevitable. "She showed me some brochures," I said neutrally, curious to see how Marcus would respond. "What did you think?" "I know the idea of moving can be overwhelming, but some of those places really do offer amazing amenities. And honestly, Mom, it might be nice for you to have more social interaction, more opportunities to make new friends." The suggestion that I was socially isolated was both inaccurate and manipulative. I had a well-established network of friends from church, from my book club, from the volunteer work I did at the local food bank. I had neighbors I had known for decades, a community that had supported me through Frank's death and continued to enrich my daily life. The idea that I needed to relocate to a commercial facility to find social interaction revealed how little my children understood about my actual circumstances and how much they were projecting their own assumptions about aging and loneliness. "I have plenty of social interaction," I said. "I'm quite content with my current living situation." There was a pause before Marcus responded, and when he did, his tone was more careful, more calculated. "Of course you are, Mom. But we're just thinking about the future, about what might happen if your health changes or if you need more support. Wouldn't it be better to make those decisions while you're still feeling good, while you can take your time and choose something you really like?" The logic was seductive and superficially reasonable. Plan ahead, make decisions while you're still capable, ensure your future security. But underlying this logic was an assumption that decline was inevitable and imminent, that my current independence was temporary and fragile. Marcus was asking me to make decisions based on hypothetical future limitations, rather than my current reality and capabilities. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm not ready to make those kinds of changes. I'm healthy, I'm independent, and I'm happy where I am." "We know you are," Marcus said quickly, "but Claire mentioned that the entrance fees for these places are pretty substantial. If you wait too long, if the trust fund loses value, or if healthcare costs eat into the principal, you might not have as many options later." This was a new argument, one that revealed a sophisticated understanding of the financial implications of delayed decision-making. Marcus was suggesting that I needed to act quickly to preserve my options, that waiting could result in diminished resources and reduced choices. It was a compelling argument, designed to create urgency and override my natural inclination to take time to consider such major decisions. But it was also an argument that revealed how carefully my children had analyzed my financial situation. Marcus knew enough about the trust fund to discuss its potential vulnerability to market fluctuations and unexpected expenses. He understood the relationship between entrance fees and asset liquidity. This wasn't casual concern, it was detailed financial planning, conducted without my input or consent. "The trust fund is well diversified," I said. "Frank was very conservative in his investment strategy, and Margaret Henley assures me that the principal is secure." The mention of my attorney's name seemed to surprise Marcus. "You've been talking to a lawyer?" "I had a routine meeting to review the trust fund documentation," I said. I wanted to make sure I understood all the provisions and protections Frank had established. "That's smart," Marcus said, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "Did she mention anything about distribution procedures? I mean, if you decided to make a large withdrawal for something like an entrance fee." The question confirmed my suspicions about my children's level of planning and preparation. Marcus wasn't just generally curious about the trust fund, He had specific questions about accessing large amounts of money for specific purposes. He and Claire had progressed beyond casual suggestions about senior living to detailed financial planning for my relocation. She explained that I have complete discretion over all distributions. The trust fund is designed to support whatever decisions I make about my living situation and care needs. This was true, but it wasn't the complete truth. Margaret Henley had also explained the duress provisions Frank had included, the protections against pressure from beneficiaries, and the documentation requirements that would make any coercive distributions legally questionable. But I wasn't ready to reveal that level of knowledge to Marcus, not until I better understood the scope of what he and Claire were planning. After I hung up the phone, I sat in Frank's old recliner, looking around the living room that had been the center of our life together for 4 decades. The furniture was all pieces we had chosen together, either as newlyweds shopping for bargains at garage sales, or as an established couple investing in quality pieces we intended to keep forever. The photographs on the mantel chronicled our family's growth and change, Claire and Marcus as babies, toddlers, school children, teenagers, young adults, wedding pictures, graduation pictures, holiday gatherings where everyone looked genuinely happy to be together. This room held the archive of our family's best moments, the physical evidence of love and commitment and shared experience. But sitting there that evening, I realized that my children no longer saw this room as a treasure trove of memory and meaning. They saw it as an asset to be liquidated, a resource to be converted into cash that could finance their vision of what my future should look like. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, cutting back the last of the season's perennials and preparing the beds for winter, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s emerged, dressed in a business suit and carrying a leather portfolio. She walked toward me with the confident stride of someone accustomed to making sales presentations. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, extending her hand as she approached. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Premier Home Solutions. I believe your daughter spoke with our office about conducting a home evaluation." I accepted her handshake, but looked at her with confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about a home evaluation. There must be some mistake." Jennifer consulted the papers in her portfolio, frowning slightly. "I have an appointment scheduled for this morning at 10:30. Claire Coleman called last week to arrange an assessment of your property for potential sale preparation." The words hit me like a physical blow. Claire had not only been researching senior living facilities, she had actually contacted real estate professionals about selling my house. She had made appointments, provided my name and address, and apparently represented herself as having authority to initiate the sale process. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I haven't authorized any property evaluation, and I'm not planning to sell my home." Jennifer looked confused and slightly embarrassed. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Your daughter was very clear that you were beginning to consider senior living options and wanted to understand the current market value of your property. She said you were hoping to make some decisions about timing based on the assessment." Even in her explanation of the misunderstanding, Jennifer was revealing the sophistication of Claire's approach. My daughter hadn't simply called to request a property appraisal. She had created a narrative about my decision-making process, positioned herself as my representative, and established a timeline for making major life changes. "I appreciate you coming out," I said, "but I'm afraid your time has been wasted. I have no interest in selling my property at this time." Jennifer nodded apologetically and gathered her materials, but before leaving, she handed me her business card. "If your situation changes or if you do decide to explore your options, please don't hesitate to call. This is a beautiful property in an excellent neighborhood. You'd have no trouble finding qualified buyers." After she drove away, I stood in my driveway for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Claire hadn't just been making suggestions about my future. She had been taking concrete steps to implement those suggestions. She had contacted real estate professionals, scheduled appointments, and represented herself as acting on my behalf. If I hadn't been home that morning, if I had been at the grocery store or visiting a friend, Jennifer Walsh would have conducted a comprehensive evaluation of my property and provided Claire with detailed information about its market value and sale potential. The implications were staggering. Claire was operating as if my decision to relocate was already made, as if the only remaining questions were logistics and timing. She was gathering the information she would need to pressure me into making quick decisions, building a case for why immediate action was necessary and beneficial. I went inside and called Claire's office immediately. Her assistant informed me that she was showing properties to clients and wouldn't be available until late afternoon, but I left a message asking her to call me as soon as possible regarding an urgent matter. While I waited for her return call, I used the time to conduct some research of my own. I called Margaret Henley's office and explained what had happened with the real estate agent, asking whether Claire's actions might constitute some form of legal overreach or fraud. "It's concerning," Margaret said after I described the morning's events. "She's representing herself as having authority to act on your behalf in matters related to your property, which could potentially constitute fraud if she's misrepresenting her legal standing. At minimum, it's a violation of your autonomy and privacy." Margaret recommended that I document the incident thoroughly, including Jennifer Walsh's business card and contact information, and that I make it clear to Claire that any future contact with real estate professionals or other service providers must have my explicit written consent. "The pattern you're describing," Margaret continued, "suggests that your daughter is moving beyond suggestions and into implementation. She's taking steps that assume your compliance with her plans, which is both presumptuous and potentially illegal." When Claire finally called that evening, her tone was immediately defensive, as if she had already anticipated my complaint. "Mom, I can explain about the real estate agent. I wasn't trying to go behind your back. I was just gathering information so we could have informed discussions about your options. You scheduled an appointment at my home without my knowledge," I said. "You represented yourself as acting on my behalf to a business professional. That's not gathering information. That's taking action." Claire was quiet for a moment before responding. "I was trying to be helpful. I thought it would be easier for you if I handled some of the preliminary research, so you wouldn't have to deal with sales calls and appointments until you were ready to make decisions." The explanation was superficially reasonable, but it revealed a fundamental disrespect for my autonomy and judgment. Claire was making decisions about what information I needed, what appointments I could handle, and what timeline was appropriate for my major life choices. She was treating me like a child who needed protection from the complexity of adult decision-making. "In the future," I said firmly, "I need you to understand that any contact with professionals regarding my property, my finances, or my living situation must have my explicit permission. I'm perfectly capable of making my own appointments and conducting my own research, when and if I decide such research is necessary." "Of course," Claire said quickly. "I didn't mean to overstep. I was just trying to help." But even as she apologized, I could hear the frustration in her voice. She was annoyed that I had discovered her initiative, annoyed that I was asserting control over a process she had begun to manage independently. Her apology was pro forma, designed to diffuse my immediate anger rather than acknowledge the fundamental inappropriateness of her action. The conversation ended cordially enough, but I knew that Claire would interpret my response as evidence of my increasing stubbornness and unreasonableness, rather than a legitimate assertion of my rights and preferences. In her mind, I was being difficult about arrangements that were obviously in my best interest, resistant to help that she was generously offering to provide. That evening, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. I drove to the office supply store in town and purchased a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews. Margaret Henley had suggested that I document any future attempts by my children to pressure me into making financial or living arrangement changes, and I realized that written notes might not be sufficient if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. The recorder was small enough to fit in my pocket or purse, simple enough to operate with the press of a button, and capable of capturing hours of conversation with clear audio quality. I practiced using it at home, recording myself, reading passages from my favorite mystery novels, then playing back the recordings to ensure I understood how to operate it effectively. I also took Margaret's advice about updating my power of attorney documentation. The existing documents named Claire as my primary agent, with Marcus as the alternate, arrangements that had made sense when Frank first encouraged me to establish them, but that now seemed potentially dangerous, given my children's willingness to act without my explicit consent. Margaret recommended that I consider naming a professional fiduciary, someone trained in elder law and financial management, who would have no personal interest in my assets, beyond their professional obligation to act in my best interest. It felt strange to consider removing my own children from these important legal roles, but their recent behavior had made it clear that they might not be able to separate their personal interests from their professional obligations to protect mine. The new power of attorney documents included specific language about my mental competency, requiring multiple medical evaluations and court oversight before any agent could act on my behalf. They also included the same duress provisions Frank had built into the trust fund, ensuring that any decisions made under pressure or coercion would be legally invalid. November slipped into December, and the holiday season brought new challenges and opportunities to observe my children's evolving strategy. Claire suggested that instead of hosting Christmas dinner at my house as we had done for the past 6 years, we should meet at a restaurant to take the burden off me. When I pointed out that I enjoyed cooking for the family and had already planned the menu, she expressed concern about my energy levels and the stress of entertaining. "You've done so much for us over the years," she said during one of our planning phone calls. "Maybe it's time to let someone else handle the hosting responsibilities." The suggestion was presented as consideration for my well-being, but I recognized it as another attempt to establish a narrative about my declining capability. If I couldn't handle cooking Christmas dinner for 6 people, something I had done effortlessly for decades, how could I possibly manage the complex responsibilities of independent living? I insisted on hosting Christmas at my home, and I made sure to prepare an elaborate meal that would demonstrate my continued competence and energy. I spent days shopping for ingredients, polishing silver, and decorating the house with the care and attention to detail that had always characterized my holiday celebrations. I wanted Claire and Marcus to see that I was not the frail, declining woman they seemed to believe I was becoming. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and clear skies, the kind of perfect winter day that made Iowa look like a postcard. I was up early as always, putting the turkey in the oven, and beginning the careful choreography of preparing multiple dishes to be ready at precisely the same time. The kitchen filled with the familiar aromas of sage and rosemary, cinnamon and nutmeg, the scents that had marked our family celebrations for as long as Claire and Marcus could remember. When my family arrived, they found a house that looked exactly as it always had during the holidays, beautifully decorated, immaculately clean, filled with the evidence of careful preparation and attention to detail. The dining room table was set with the good china and crystal, the flowers were fresh and every dish was prepared to perfection. But instead of acknowledging my obvious competence and energy, Claire and Marcus seemed almost disappointed by the flawless execution of the meal. They praised the food and thanked me for my efforts, but I could sense their frustration that I had not provided them with evidence of decline or struggle. During dinner conversation, Marcus casually mentioned that Angela had been researching senior living facilities in Phoenix, just out of curiosity about what was available in their area. He described beautiful communities with golf courses and swimming pools, emphasizing the active lifestyle and social opportunities they provided. "It sounds lovely," I said politely, recognizing the suggestion for what it was. Claire picked up the thread immediately. "The facilities here in Iowa are really impressive too. I drove by Sunset Manor last week, and the grounds are beautiful. They have a lovely walking path around a pond, and the main building looks more like a hotel than anything institutional." Both of my children were painting pictures of idyllic retirement communities, trying to make senior living sound appealing and desirable rather than necessary or inevitable. But underneath their enthusiastic descriptions, I could hear the same message they had been delivering for months, that my current living situation was unsustainable, that change was inevitable, and that they were prepared to help me make the transition. After dinner, as we sat in the living room exchanging gifts, Marcus brought up the subject of the trust fund directly for the first time. "Mom," he said as he handed me a beautifully wrapped box containing a cashmere scarf, "I've been thinking about the conversation we had a few weeks ago about financial planning. Have you given any more thought to how you want to handle distributions from the trust fund, if you do decide to make some lifestyle changes. The question was carefully phrased to sound casual and hypothetical, but it was actually quite specific and pointed. Marcus wasn't asking whether I planned to make lifestyle changes. He was asking how I planned to finance them. He was treating my relocation as a foregone conclusion and moving directly to the mechanics of implementation. I haven't made any decisions about lifestyle changes, I said, unwrapping his gift with deliberate care, but if I ever do, I'm confident that the trust fund provides adequate flexibility to support whatever choices I make. Of course, Marcus said quickly. I just wanted to make sure you knew that if you ever needed help navigating the paperwork or understanding the distribution procedures, Claire and I are here to support you. The offer of help was generous and appropriately filial, but it was also strategic. By positioning themselves as my assistants in managing trust fund distributions, Marcus and Claire were creating a role for themselves in any financial decisions I might make. They were ensuring that they would be involved in and informed about any large expenditures, any changes to my asset allocation, any decisions that might affect their eventual inheritance. I appreciate that, I said, but Margaret Henley has been very helpful in explaining the trust fund procedures. Frank chose her specifically because of her expertise in estate planning and elder law. The mention of my attorney seemed to create a momentary tension in the room. Both Claire and Marcus exchanged a quick glance before Marcus continued the conversation. I'm sure she's very knowledgeable, he said, but sometimes, it's helpful to have family involved in these discussions too, people who understand your personal situation and your family's history. The suggestion that my attorney might not understand my personal situation was both subtle and insulting. Marcus was implying that legal expertise was insufficient, that family members had unique insights that would be valuable in making financial decisions. But what he was really suggesting was that Claire and I should be included in conversations and decisions that were legally and ethically mine alone to make. That evening, after my family had left and I was cleaning up the remnants of our Christmas celebration, I found myself thinking about Frank and what he would have made of the conversations I had just endured. He had always been protective of my independence, supportive of my judgment, confident in my ability to make wise decisions about important matters. He had never suggested that I needed supervision or assistance beyond what any reasonable person might require when dealing with complex legal or financial issues. The trust fund Frank had established was a reflection of his respect for my competence and autonomy. He had given me complete control over the assets, complete discretion over distributions, and complete authority over investment decisions. He had trusted me to manage substantial resources wisely and to make appropriate decisions about my own care and living situation as I aged. But my children were operating from a fundamentally different assumption. They saw the trust fund as a family asset that required family management, a resource that should be preserved and protected through collaborative decision-making. They were treating me as the custodian of their inheritance rather than the owner of my own financial security. The recorder I had purchased weeks earlier had been sitting in my pocket throughout Christmas dinner, silently capturing every conversation about senior living, trust fund distributions, and lifestyle change. When I played back the recording that evening, I was struck by how carefully my children had coordinated their approach, how seamlessly they had built upon each other's comments, how thoroughly they had prepared their argument. This wasn't spontaneous concern about my welfare, it was a planned campaign to convince me that major life changes were necessary and inevitable, and based on the sophistication of their approach, I suspected that it had been going on much longer than I had realized. The next morning, I called Margaret Henley's office and left a message requesting an urgent appointment. I needed legal advice about how to protect myself from what was clearly an escalating effort to manipulate me into making decisions that would benefit my children more than me. I also needed to understand what legal recourse I might have if their pressure campaign continued to intensify. The year was ending, but I had a feeling that the real battle for my independence and autonomy was just beginning. My children had shown their hand, revealed their strategy, and demonstrated their willingness to act without my consent in pursuit of their objectives. Now I needed to decide how to respond, how to protect myself, and how to preserve the life Frank had worked so hard to secure for me. The conversation with Margaret Henley would be crucial, but first I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting for, and exactly what I was fighting against. My children loved me, I still believed that, but they also saw me as an obstacle to their own financial security. The challenge would be finding a way to preserve our relationship while protecting my right to live my life on my own terms. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought an unexpected sense of purpose to my day. Instead of the usual post-holiday melancholy that sometimes settled over me during the quiet winter months, I found myself energized by a clarity of mission I hadn't experienced in years. Margaret Henley had scheduled an emergency consultation for December 28th, and I spent the intervening days preparing for what I now understood would be a crucial conversation about protecting my legal rights and financial autonomy. I had transcribed key portions of the Christmas dinner recording, creating a written document that captured not just the words my children had spoken, but the careful coordination of their approach. Reading their statements in transcript form stripped away the veneer of casual conversation and revealed the calculated nature of their campaign. They had clearly rehearsed their talking points, anticipated my responses, and prepared follow-up arguments designed to overcome my resistance. Margaret's office felt like a sanctuary when I arrived that cold Thursday morning, carrying a manila folder containing the transcripts, Jennifer Walsh's business card, and detailed notes about every conversation I had recorded over the past month. Margaret herself appeared more serious than she had during our previous meeting, her usual professional warmth tempered by what seemed like genuine concern about the situation I was facing. "Miss Coleman," she said as we settled into the chairs beside her desk, "I've reviewed the materials you sent over, and I'm deeply troubled by what I'm seeing. Your children's behavior has moved well beyond the realm of normal family concern into what could constitute financial elder abuse and potentially criminal fraud." The words hung in the air between us like a diagnosis I wasn't ready to accept. Criminal fraud. My own children. The concept seemed incompatible with everything I thought I knew about Claire and Marcus, everything I believed about the family Frank and I had raised together. Margaret continued, her voice gentle but firm. "When your daughter contacted that real estate agent and represented herself as acting on your behalf, she committed what could be considered identity fraud. When both children began making inquiries about trust fund distributions without your knowledge or consent, they were potentially attempting to access assets that belong solely to you. And this coordinated campaign to pressure you into making major life changes could constitute elder abuse under Iowa state law." I absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile Margaret's legal assessment with my emotional understanding of my children's motivation. "They genuinely believe they're acting in my best interests," I said finally. "I don't think they see themselves as committing fraud or abuse. Intent matters in criminal law," Margaret replied, "but it doesn't change the legal reality of their action. Whether they believe they're helping you or not, they're violating your legal rights and potentially breaking several laws. More importantly, their belief that they know what's best for you doesn't give them any legal authority to act on those beliefs." Margaret explained that my situation was unfortunately common, particularly among older adults with substantial assets and adult children facing their own financial pressure. The combination of economic stress and rationalized concern for elderly parents created what she called a perfect storm for financial elder abuse. "The most dangerous aspect of what your children are doing," she continued, "is how they're using your own love for them as a weapon against you. They're counting on your desire to maintain family harmony, your reluctance to believe the worst about people you've raised and supported, and your natural deference to their apparent expertise and concern." The phrase "using your own love for them as a weapon" struck me with particular force. It captured something I had sensed but hadn't been able to articulate about the emotional manipulation underlying my children's campaign. They weren't simply pressuring me to make decisions they favored, they were making it emotionally costly for me to resist those decisions. Margaret recommended a three-pronged strategy for protecting myself going forward. First, I needed to establish clear legal boundaries, through formal documentation that would make any future attempts at manipulation legally actionable. Second, I needed to create what she called financial firewalls that would prevent my children from accessing information about my assets or influencing decisions about their management. Third, I needed to document any future pressure or coercion in ways that would be admissible in court if legal action became necessary. The first step involved updating several legal documents to remove Claire and Marcus from any positions of authority or influence over my financial affairs. Margaret had already prepared new power of attorney documents, naming a professional fiduciary, but she now recommended additional measures including a formal competency declaration, signed by multiple physicians, and a detailed living will that would prevent my children from making healthcare decisions on my behalf. These documents will serve as a legal fortress, Margaret explained. They'll make it virtually impossible for anyone to claim that you're mentally incompetent or that family members should have authority over your decisions. They'll also create legal consequences for anyone who attempts to pressure or coerce you into changing these arrangements. The financial firewalls were more complex, but equally important. Margaret recommended moving my checking and savings accounts to a different bank, one where Claire and Marcus had no existing relationships or knowledge of my business. She also suggested changing my mailing address for all financial statements to her law office, ensuring that my children couldn't monitor my account activity or spending patterns. Information is power, Margaret said. Right now, your children have access to far too much information about your financial situation. They know about the trust fund, they understand your monthly expenses, and they're gathering data about your property value and asset allocation. We need to cut off that information flow immediately. The most crucial recommendation involved what Margaret called defensive documentation. She wanted me to continue recording conversations with my children, but with a specific focus on any statements that could be construed as threats, coercion, or attempts to access my assets without proper authorization. If this situation escalates to litigation, she explained, these recordings could be the difference between winning and losing. Your children are clearly intelligent and sophisticated in their approach, but they're also overconfident. They're saying things on these recordings that would be extremely damaging to them in court. Margaret also recommended that I begin keeping a detailed journal of all interactions with Claire and Marcus, noting not just what they said but when they said it, who else was present, and what specific actions they took or requested. This documentation would create a timeline that could demonstrate the systematic nature of their pressure campaign. The law recognizes that elder abuse often involves patterns of behavior rather than single incidents, Margaret explained. We need to create a clear record that shows this isn't just a few isolated conversations, but an ongoing effort to undermine your autonomy and access your assets. Before leaving Margaret's office that day, I signed several new legal documents, and authorized her to begin the process of establishing my financial firewalls. I also provided her with copies of all my existing account information, insurance policies and investment statements, giving her the comprehensive picture she would need to protect my interests effectively. The drive home from Margaret's office felt like crossing a bridge I wouldn't be able to cross again. I had committed myself to a course of action that would fundamentally change my relationship with my children, whether they knew it immediately or not. I was no longer simply resisting their suggestions. I was actively protecting myself from their influence. That evening, I implemented the first visible change in my new defensive strategy. I called Claire and Marcus separately to inform them that I would be changing banks, and that they should no longer expect to receive copies of my financial statements or updates about my account activity. Claire's reaction was immediate and intense. Why would you change bank? You've been with First National for decades. They know you there. They understand your situation. I've decided I want more privacy regarding my financial affairs, I said, using language Margaret had suggested. I'm consolidating my accounts with an institution that specializes in serving older clients. But Mom, what if there's an emergency? What if you need help managing something and we can't access the information we need to assist you? The question revealed the assumption underlying all of Claire's concerns, that she should have access to my financial information, that she should be able to monitor my account activity, that she was entitled to be involved in managing my affairs. Her distress wasn't about my welfare, but about her loss of oversight and control. In the event of a genuine emergency, I said, my attorney has all the necessary information and authority to act on my behalf. Your attorney? Claire's voice rose slightly. Mom, lawyers are expensive, and they don't know you the way family does. Why would you want a stranger handling your personal business? The suggestion that Margaret Henley was a stranger was both inaccurate and revealing. Frank had worked with her firm for years. She understood her family's legal and financial history better than anyone except Frank himself, and she was professionally obligated to act solely in my interests rather than balancing competing family loyalty. Margaret Henley is hardly a stranger, I said. She's been handling our family's legal affairs for years, and Frank specifically chose her because of her expertise and integrity. The conversation ended cordially enough, but I could hear the frustration and alarm in Claire's voice. She understood that my decision to change banks represented more than a simple preference for privacy. It represented a fundamental shift in how I was approaching decisions about my independence and autonomy. Marcus's reaction was more measured but equally revealing. He asked thoughtful questions about my reasons for changing banks, expressed concern about the costs and complications of transferring accounts, and offered to help with the administrative details of making such a transition. It can be a real hassle to change banks, he said. There are automatic payments to redirect, new checks to order, customer service relationships to rebuild. If you want more privacy, couldn't you just ask them to remove Claire and me from the account notifications without going through all the trouble of switching institutions? The offer to help was generous and filial, but it was also strategic. By positioning himself as my assistant in managing the bank transfer, Marcus would gain access to exactly the kind of financial information I was trying to protect. He would learn about my new accounts, my new banking relationships, and my new procedures for managing my assets. I appreciate the offer, I said, but Margaret's office is handling all the administrative details. They specialize in this kind of transition for older clients. Your attorney is handling your banking? Marcus sounded genuinely surprised. That seems like an expensive way to manage something you could do yourself. The emphasis on expense was telling. Marcus was suggesting that I was wasting money by involving legal professionals in financial decisions I should be able to handle independently. But his concern about cost was really concern about my independence. If I was capable of managing my own banking transitions, then I was probably capable of managing all my other affairs without family oversight or assistance. Over the following days, I methodically implemented the protective measures Margaret had recommended. I visited my new bank, opened new accounts, and arranged for all my automatic payments and direct deposits to be transferred. I changed my mailing address with all financial institutions to Margaret's office. I updated my contact information with my insurance companies, investment advisors, and healthcare providers. Each step felt like building a wall around my autonomy, creating barriers that would prevent my children from monitoring or influencing my financial decisions. But each step also felt like a betrayal of the family relationships I had cherished and nurtured for decades. The most difficult change involved my healthcare providers. Margaret had recommended that I update my emergency contact information to list her office first, followed by a trusted friend from church, with Claire and Marcus relegated to secondary contact. This change would prevent my children from gaining automatic access to my medical information or treatment decisions if I ever became incapacitated. Dr. Hoffman, my longtime physician, seemed surprised by the request when I visited his office in early January. "Miss Coleman," he said, as he reviewed the new contact forms, "is everything all right with your family? It's unusual for patients to remove their children as primary emergency contacts unless there's been some kind of conflict." I explained that I was simply taking steps to ensure my privacy and independence as I aged, that I wanted professional rather than family oversight of my healthcare decisions. Dr. Hoffman nodded understandingly, but I could see the concern in his eye. "I want to make sure you know," he said gently, "that based on my examinations and our conversations, I see no evidence that you're experiencing any cognitive decline or judgment impairment. You're as mentally sharp and competent as anyone I treat, regardless of age." The unsolicited reassurance about my mental competency was both gratifying and troubling. It suggested that Dr. Hoffman had been approached by someone questioning my cognitive abilities, someone who had planted seeds of doubt about my decision-making capacity. "Has anyone contacted you about my mental health?" I asked directly. Dr. Hoffman hesitated before answering. "Your daughter called a few weeks ago with some concerns about your memory and judgment. She mentioned that you'd been making what seemed like unusual decisions, and she wanted to know if there were warning signs she should watch for." The revelation that Claire had been discussing my mental health with my physician without my knowledge or consent was both shocking and infuriating. She had been attempting to create a medical record of cognitive decline, laying the groundwork for future challenges to my competency and decision-making authority. "What did you tell her?" I told her that I couldn't discuss your medical information without your consent, but that in my professional opinion, you showed no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. I also suggested that if she had specific concerns, she should encourage you to schedule an appointment for a comprehensive evaluation. Dr. Hoffman's ethical response had protected my privacy and autonomy, but Claire's inquiry revealed the sophistication of her strategy. She wasn't just pressuring me directly to make decisions she favored, she was attempting to build a case for my mental incompetence that could be used to override my preferences legally. I asked Hoffman to document our conversation in my medical records, including his assessment of my cognitive abilities and his account of Claire's inquiry. I also authorized him to share this information with Margaret Henley if necessary for legal proceedings. "Mrs. Coleman," Dr. Hoffman said as our appointment concluded, "I hope you know that I'm always available if you need support or advocacy regarding your healthcare decision. What you're describing sounds like a difficult family situation, and I want you to feel confident that your medical team will respect your autonomy and judgment." The drive home from Dr. Hoffman's office marked a turning point in my understanding of what I was facing. Claire and Marcus weren't just pressuring me to make decisions they favored, they were actively working to undermine my credibility and competence in the eyes of professionals who might be called upon to evaluate my capacity for independent living. That evening, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. I called Grace Patterson, my oldest and most trusted friend, and asked if she would be willing to serve as my primary emergency contact and healthcare advocate. Grace and I had known each other for over 30 years, had supported each other through marriages, divorces, deaths, and all the ordinary crises that punctuate a long life. "Of course, Bertha," Grace said without hesitation. "But can I ask what's prompted? Are you having problems with Claire and Marcus?" I explained the situation as clearly and objectively as I could, describing my children's campaign to pressure me into senior living, their attempts to access my financial information, and their inquiries about my mental health with medical professionals. Grace listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. "Oh honey," she said when I finished, "I'm so sorry you're dealing with this, but I'm not entirely surprised. I've seen this kind of thing happen to other women our age, especially women with assets their children want to access." Grace's lack of surprise was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it confirmed that my situation wasn't unique or inexplicable, that other intelligent women had faced similar challenges from their own family. Disturbing because it suggested that financial elder abuse was common enough that experienced observers like Grace had learned to recognize the warning signs. "The important thing," Grace continued, "is that you're taking steps to protect yourself before the situation gets worse. Some women wait until their children have already gained control of their finances or their healthcare decisions, and then it's much harder to regain independence." Grace agreed to serve not only as my emergency contact, but as what Margaret called a witness advocate, someone who could observe and document any future attempts by my children to pressure or manipulate me. She also offered to attend family gatherings or important meetings if I needed an objective observer to verify what was said and done. "I've been looking for a way to be more helpful to you since Frank died," Grace said. "This gives me a chance to actually support you in something that matters." Over the following weeks, I settled into new routines designed to protect my independence, while maintaining the appearance of normal family relationships. I continued to call Claire and Marcus regularly, but I was careful to avoid discussing my finances, my living situation, or my future plan. I deflected their questions about my banking changes by expressing satisfaction with my new institution's customer service. I redirected conversations about senior living by emphasizing my contentment with my current lifestyle. The defensive documentation Margaret had recommended became a daily practice. I kept detailed notes of every conversation with my children, recorded phone calls when possible, and maintained a log of their visits and the topics they raised. The picture that emerged from this documentation was of a systematic campaign that had been building for months longer than I had initially realized. Reviewing my notes from the previous autumn, I could see that Claire's first casual questions about my daily routine had been intelligence gathering rather than genuine interest. Marcus's inquiries about my monthly expenses had been financial reconnaissance rather than family concern. Even their increased attention after my hospital stay had been strategic rather than spontaneous. They had seen my brief medical episode as an opportunity to advance their agenda rather than simply an occasion for family support. The most revealing pattern in my documentation was how my children coordinated their approaches without appearing to do so. Claire would raise concerns about my safety and well-being during one conversation, then Marcus would follow up days later with practical suggestions about addressing those concerns. Claire would research senior living facilities, then Marcus would provide financial analysis about affording them. They were working together seamlessly, presenting a united front, while maintaining the fiction that their suggestions were independent and spontaneous. February brought a test of my new defensive strategies when Claire announced that she and Derek were planning to visit for a long weekend in early March. She presented the visit as a social call, an opportunity to spend quality time together during the quiet winter months, but I suspected it represented an escalation of their campaign to pressure me into making major life changes. "We haven't had a real visit in months," Claire said during the phone call where she proposed the trip. "I miss our long conversations, and Derek wants to help you with some of those maintenance projects you mentioned last fall." I hadn't mentioned any maintenance projects that required Derek's assistance, but I recognized the reference as part of the narrative Claire was building about my inability to manage my property independently. By offering to help with problems I hadn't reported, Derek would be able to discover or create evidence of decline and neglect. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I haven't been putting off any maintenance projects. The house is in excellent condition." "I'm sure it is," Claire said quickly, "but Derek just wants to check the gutters, maybe look at the furnace filters, that kind of thing. You know how men like to feel useful." The explanation was plausible and innocent, but I recognized it as reconnaissance disguised as helpful. Derek would be inspecting my property for problems that could be used to justify concerns about my ability to maintain it properly. He would be gathering information about needed repairs, deferred maintenance, and potential safety hazards. I agreed to the visit but made my own preparation. I arranged for my cleaning service to do a thorough spring cleaning before Claire and Derek arrived. I had my furnace serviced by a professional technician who provided a written report confirming that all systems were functioning properly. I hired a handyman to inspect and repair any minor issues with gutters, plumbing, or electrical systems. When Claire and Derek arrived that Friday evening in early March, they found a house that was immaculate, well-maintained, and obviously cared for by a competent owner. Every room was clean and organized, every system was functioning properly, and every detail suggested careful attention to domestic responsibilities. But instead of acknowledging the evident quality of my home maintenance, Claire seemed to focus on finding problems and deficiencies. She commented on the age of my appliances, the outdated style of my bathroom fixtures, the energy and efficiency of my older window. She framed these observations as concerns for my comfort and safety rather than criticisms of my housekeeping. But the message was clear. My home was becoming a burden that required more attention and resources than I could reasonably provide. Derek was more subtle but equally systematic in his assessment. He examined my basement for moisture problems, my attic for insulation deficiencies, my exterior for signs of weather damage. He found minor issues: a loose board on the back deck, a small stain on the basement floor, some peeling paint around one window, that he presented as evidence of the ongoing maintenance challenges facing any older homeowner. "These things aren't major problems," he assured me as he compiled a list of his findings, "but they're the kind of issues that can become expensive if they're not addressed promptly, and honestly some of them require contractors who can be hard to find and expensive to hire." The implication was that I was facing mounting maintenance responsibilities that would exceed my energy, competence, and financial resources. Derek was building a case that home ownership was becoming impractical for someone in my situation, that the smart thing to do would be to sell while the property was still in good condition. That evening, as we sat in my living room after dinner, Claire broached the subject I had been expecting since she announced the visit. "Mom, Derek and I have been talking about your situation, and we're really concerned about the long-term sustainability of you staying in this house alone. I had the small recorder in my pocket, activated before my children arrived, ready to capture whatever conversation they had planned for this moment. My situation seems quite sustainable to me, I said calmly. I'm healthy, independent, and perfectly capable of managing my household responsibilities. We know you are, Claire said quickly, but we're thinking about what happens as you get older, what happens if your health changes, or if the house needs major repairs you can't handle. Derek leaned forward in his chair, adopting the serious expression he wore when discussing business matters. Claire and I have been researching the real estate market, and property values in this neighborhood are at an all-time high. If you're ever going to consider relocating, now would be an ideal time financially. There it was, the sales pitch I had been anticipating for months. They weren't suggesting that I needed to move immediately, but they were arguing that I needed to make the decision while market conditions were favorable. They were creating urgency around a choice I hadn't agreed to consider. I'm not planning to relocate, I said simply. Claire exchanged a quick glance with Derek before continuing. We understand that this is your home, that it has sentimental value and memories you treasure, but we've been thinking about alternatives that might give you the best of both worlds. She outlined a plan they had apparently developed in considerable detail. I would sell the house while the market was strong, use the proceeds to purchase a condominium in one of the upscale senior communities they had researched, and invest the remaining money to supplement my trust fund distribution. The condo would provide maintenance-free living, built-in social opportunities, and proximity to healthcare services, while the additional investments would ensure financial security for the rest of my life. The numbers really work beautifully, Derek said, producing a folder containing spreadsheets and calculations. Your house should sell for around $400,000, and a nice condo at Sunset Manor would cost about $300,000. That leaves you with $100,000 to invest, plus whatever you save on property taxes, utilities and maintenance. The financial analysis was thorough and professionally prepared, complete with projections about investment returns, estimates of living expenses, and comparisons of my current costs with anticipated condo fees. Derek had clearly spent considerable time developing these calculations, treating my relocation as a business decision that could be optimized through careful planning and analysis. Have you considered that I might not want to live in a senior community? That I might prefer to age in place in the home Frank and I chose together? Claire's expression softened into what I recognized as her sympathetic mode. Of course we've considered that, Mom, but we've also considered what Dad would want for you now, 6 years after his death. Don't you think he'd want you to be safe and comfortable, with people around who could help if you needed it? The invocation of Frank's memory was both manipulative and presumptuous. Claire was claiming to understand what Frank would have wanted while ignoring the careful legal arrangements he had actually made to protect my independence and autonomy. She was using my grief and love for my deceased husband to pressure me into decisions that contradicted his stated wish. Your father established the trust fund specifically to ensure that I could live independently for the rest of my life, I said. He wanted me to have choices, not limitations. But Dad couldn't have anticipated how much everything has changed, Derek interjected. Healthcare costs, property maintenance, insurance premiums, everything is more expensive than it was when he set up the trust fund. The money that seemed adequate then might not be sufficient to support independent living indefinitely. This was a new argument, one that suggested the trust fund itself was inadequate for its intended purpose. Derek was implying that Frank's financial planning had been insufficient, that the resources he had accumulated were inadequate to support the lifestyle he had intended to provide for me. The suggestion was both factually incorrect and emotionally devastating. Margaret Henley had confirmed that the trust fund was conservatively invested, well diversified, and more than adequate to support my current lifestyle indefinitely. Frank's financial planning had been careful and thorough, based on realistic assumptions about inflation, healthcare costs, and longevity. The trust fund is performing exactly as Frank intended, I said firmly. I have no financial concerns about continuing to live independent. Claire and Derek exchanged another glance, this one longer and more meaningful. They had clearly anticipated this response and prepared a counter-argument. Mom, Claire said gently, we need to talk about something that might be difficult to hear. Derek and I have been concerned about some of the financial decisions you've been making lately, changing banks without consulting anyone, involving lawyers in routine matters, making choices that seem designed to shut out the people who care about you most. The accusation that my protective measures constituted poor financial decisions was both clever and insidious. Claire was reframing my efforts to maintain independence as evidence of incompetence, suggesting that my desire for privacy and autonomy were symptoms of impaired judgment, rather than reasonable responses to their pressure. I've been consulting with legal and financial professionals to ensure that my affairs are properly managed, I said. That seems like prudent planning rather than poor decision-making. But Mom, Derek said, you've been with the same bank for decades, you've had the same financial advisor for years, you've had established relationships with people who know you and understand your situation. Why would you abandon all that familiarity and trust to start over with strangers? The question was designed to make my changes seem irrational and self-defeating, to suggest that I was throwing away valuable relationships in favor of impersonal professional services. But Derek was ignoring the fact that my established relationships had become sources of information for my children, ways for them to monitor and influence my financial decisions. I value privacy in my financial affairs. I prefer to work with professionals who understand that I'm the sole decision maker regarding my assets and my living situation. Of course you're the decision maker, Claire said quickly. No one is suggesting otherwise. We just want to make sure you have all the information and support you need to make the best possible decisions. But even as she spoke these words, Claire was undermining them. The entire conversation had been designed to pressure me into making specific decisions, selling my house, moving to senior living, restructuring my financial arrangements. They weren't offering information and support, they were offering conclusions and implementation plans. The conversation continued for another hour, with Claire and Derek presenting increasingly detailed arguments about why relocation was necessary, financially wise, and ultimately inevitable. They had researched every aspect of the transition they were proposing, from real estate law to senior living contracts to investment strategies. They had prepared responses to every objection I might raise, solutions to every problem I might identify. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that I would be grateful for their initiative, appreciative of their research, and ultimately persuaded by their thorough planning. They had not anticipated that I would see their preparation as evidence of presumption rather than caring, their solutions as proof of disrespect rather than love. When they finally left on Sunday afternoon, promising to give me time to think about everything they had presented, I sat in my empty house, listening to the silence and processing what I had learned. My children weren't just suggesting that I consider major life changes, they were demanding that I implement specific changes they had already planned in detail. They weren't offering support for whatever decisions I might make, they were expecting compliance with decisions they had already made on my behalf. The recording of our weekend conversations would provide Margaret Henley with powerful evidence of the pressure campaign my children were conducting. But more importantly, the weekend had provided me with absolute clarity about what I was facing and what I needed to do to protect myself. The time for defensive measures was ending, the time for strategic action was beginning. Part 4. The Final Reckoning. The moment of truth arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number from Phoenix. I almost didn't answer, expecting another sales call or survey, but something prompted me to pick up on the fourth ring. Miss Coleman, this is Patricia Valdez from Southwest Financial Services. I'm calling because we've received some documentation regarding your trust fund that requires verification. Your son Marcus Coleman has submitted paperwork requesting information about potential early distributions for what he describes as emergency relocation expenses. The words hit me like ice water in my veins. Marcus had not simply been researching trust fund procedures or offering to help with paperwork. He had actually submitted formal requests for financial information, representing himself as acting on my behalf in securing funds for the senior living transition he and Claire had been planning. I haven't authorized any such requests, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Marcus has no authority to act on my behalf regarding the trust fund or any other financial matters. Patricia Valdez before responding. That's concerning, Mrs. Coleman. The documentation he provided suggests that you're experiencing cognitive difficulties and that he's been appointed to assist with your financial decision-making. He's provided what appears to be medical documentation supporting these claims. Medical document. Marcus had somehow obtained or fabricated documents suggesting that I was mentally incompetent. Documents he was using to justify accessing my assets without my consent. The sophistication and audacity of his approach was breathtaking and terrifying. I can assure you that I'm completely mentally competent, I said. I haven't appointed anyone to assist with my financial decisions, and any documentation suggesting otherwise is fraudulent. I understand your concern, Patricia said carefully. In situations like this, we typically require independent verification of a client's mental capacity and legal authority before processing any requests. Would you be willing to have your physician and attorney provide statements confirming your competency and the validity of your current legal arrangement? I agreed immediately and asked Patricia to document our conversation thoroughly, including my explicit statement that Marcus had no authority to act on my behalf. I also requested copies of all documentation he had submitted, including the alleged medical records he had used to support his claim. Within an hour of ending that call, I was on the phone with Margaret Henley, recounting the conversation and requesting emergency legal action to protect my assets from what now constituted attempted fraud on a massive scale. This changes everything, Margaret said after I finished explaining Patricia Valdez's call. What Marcus has done, submitting fraudulent documentation to access your trust fund, is a felony. We're no longer dealing with family pressure or emotional manipulation. We're dealing with actual criminal activity. Margaret explained that we needed to act quickly and decisively to prevent further attempts at fraud while building a legal case against both of my children for their roles in what had clearly been a coordinated campaign of financial elder abuse. The first step involved securing restraining orders that would prevent Claire and Marcus from contacting me or any of my financial institutions. The second step required obtaining copies of all the fraudulent documentation Marcus had submitted, analyzing how he had obtained or created false medical records, and determining whether Claire had been involved in the fraud directly or simply as a co-conspirator. The good news, Margaret continued, is that we have extensive documentation of their pressure campaign, including recordings of conversations where they discussed accessing your assets and making decisions about your living situation without your consent. The bad news is that they've escalated beyond pressure into actual fraud, which means we're now dealing with people who are willing to commit serious crimes to access your money. That afternoon, Margaret filed emergency motions requesting restraining orders and asset protection measures. She also contacted the FBI's Elder Fraud Division, reporting Marcus's attempted theft and requesting an investigation into the source of the fraudulent medical documentation he had provided to Southwest Financial Service. While Margaret handled the legal aspects of protecting me, I faced the emotional challenge of accepting that my own children, people I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for throughout their lives, were willing to commit felonies to steal my money. The transition from family conflict to criminal investigation was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Grace Patterson arrived at my house that evening with a casserole, a bottle of wine, and the kind of practical emotional support that only a decades-long friendship can provide. She listened without judgment as I recounted the day's revelations, holding my hand while I cried for the children I thought I had raised and the family I thought we had been. "Honey," Grace said gently, "you did everything right. You raised them with love and values and opportunity. What they've chosen to do with those gifts isn't your fault or your responsibility." But even as Grace offered comfort, I struggled with guilt and self-doubt. Had I been too generous with money over the years, creating expectations that my children felt entitled to fulfill? Had I failed to teach them about boundaries and respect for other people's autonomy? Had Frank and I somehow created the conditions that led to this betrayal? "Stop," Grace said firmly when I voiced these concerns. "You're blaming yourself for their criminal behavior. That's exactly what abusers want their victims to do, question themselves instead of holding the abusers accountable." The word victim was difficult to accept, but Grace was right. I had become the victim of financial elder abuse, and my children had become the perpetrator. The family dynamics I thought I understood had been replaced by criminal activity that required legal rather than emotional responses. The next morning brought confirmation that Marcus's fraud attempt had been even more extensive than initially apparent. Patricia Valdez called with additional information about the documentation he had provided, including forged medical reports purporting to show cognitive decline, fraudulent power of attorney documents, naming himself as my legal representative, and fabricated financial statements, suggesting that I was unable to manage my own affairs. The medical reports are particularly concerning, Patricia explained. They appear to be genuine documents from real physicians, but when we contacted the doctor's offices for verification, they had no record of treating you or conducting the evaluations described in the report. This meant that Marcus had not only committed fraud, but had also forged medical documents and impersonated healthcare professionals, federal crimes that carried substantial prison sentences. The scope of his criminal activity suggested careful planning and a willingness to take enormous legal risks to access my assets. Margaret Henley confirmed that the FBI was treating Marcus's actions as part of a broader pattern of elder fraud, a growing criminal enterprise that targeted older adults with substantial assets. The investigation would examine not only Marcus's direct actions, but also whether he had assistance from other family members, professional associates, or criminal networks. The forged medical documents are particularly serious, Margaret explained. That's identity theft, fraud, and impersonation of medical professionals. The federal penalties for these crimes are severe, especially when they're committed against elderly victims. While law enforcement began their investigation, I faced practical decisions about how to protect myself from further attempts at fraud or manipulation. Margaret recommended that I consider relocating temporarily while restraining orders were processed, and while my children remained unaware that their criminal activity had been discovered. Right now they don't know that Marcus's fraud attempt has been exposed, Margaret said. That gives us a tactical advantage, but it also means they might escalate their pressure campaign if they think you're continuing to resist their suggestion. The idea of leaving my home even temporarily felt like letting my children win, like allowing their pressure campaign to succeed in driving me away from the life I had built. But Margaret's security concerns were valid, and I recognized that my physical safety might be at risk from people who had already demonstrated a willingness to commit serious crime. Grace offered to let me stay at her house for as long as necessary, but Margaret suggested a more strategic approach. She recommended that I check into a secure hotel under an assumed name, while she coordinated with law enforcement to ensure my safety and privacy during the investigation. The hotel option gives you security and anonymity, Margaret explained. It also prevents your children from showing up at Grace's house looking for you, which could put her at risk as well. I spent that Wednesday evening packing a small suitcase, trying to decide what items I might need for an extended stay away from home. The process felt surreal, preparing to flee from my own children like a refugee from domestic violence. But Margaret's recommendation proved prescient when Claire called that evening with what she described as urgent family business that required an immediate in-person meeting. "Mom, I need to come over tonight," Claire said, her voice tight with what sounded like barely controlled panic. "There are some things Marcus and I need to discuss with you about the trust fund, and they can't wait." The timing of her call, just hours after Marcus's fraud attempt had been exposed, suggested that they knew their criminal activity had been discovered. Either Marcus had been contacted by Southwest Financial Services about the failed fraud attempt, or they had other sources of information about the investigation. "Tonight isn't convenient," I said carefully, remembering Margaret's advice about not revealing what I knew until law enforcement was ready to act. "Perhaps we could schedule something for later in the week." "This can't wait," Claire insisted. "Mom, there are some serious problems with your financial situation that need immediate attention. Marcus discovered some irregularities in the trust fund management, and we need to discuss emergency measures to protect your assets." The claim that Marcus had discovered irregularities was clearly a fabricated justification for accessing my financial information. Claire was trying to create urgency around fictional problems that would require their intervention to solve. It was a classic fraud technique, creating artificial crises that demanded immediate action. "I'm not aware of any problems with the trust fund," I said. "If there are genuine concerns, I can discuss them with Margaret Henley tomorrow." "Your lawyer?" Claire's voice rose sharply. "Mom, this is a family matter. These are sensitive financial issues that need to be handled discreetly, not broadcast to outside parties." The emphasis on discretion was revealing. Claire wanted to discuss emergency measures regarding my assets, without legal oversight or professional documentation. She was trying to create conditions where she and Marcus could pressure me into making immediate financial decisions without the protections that legal representation would provide. Any significant changes to my financial arrangements will be handled through appropriate legal channels, I said firmly. Claire was quiet for a moment before responding, and when she did, her tone had shifted from urgency to something that sounded almost threatening. Mom, I think you need to understand that Marcus and I are trying to protect you from some very serious problems. If you won't let us help you, if you keep shutting us out and making decisions without family input, you could lose everything. The warning that I could lose everything if I didn't comply with their demands was the closest Claire had come to making an explicit threat. She was suggesting that my refusal to cooperate with their plans would result in financial catastrophe, that my independence was putting my assets at risk. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm confident in my financial management and my legal protection. After hanging up, I called Margaret immediately to report the conversation and to confirm that I should proceed with the hotel relocation plan. Margaret agreed that Claire's call suggested an escalation that could become dangerous, particularly if my children realized that their fraud attempt had been exposed and that they were facing criminal charges. They're panicking, Margaret said. People who commit crimes often make desperate decisions when they think they're about to be caught. You need to be somewhere safe while law enforcement handles the next phase of the investigation. That night I checked into the Riverside Inn under the name Margaret had arranged, a quiet hotel about 40 minutes from my home that catered to business travelers and offered both security and anonymity. The room was comfortable but impersonal, with generic furniture and artwork that reminded me I was living like a fugitive from my own family. The next morning brought news that confirmed Margaret's concerns about my safety. Grace called to report that Claire and Derek had arrived at my house before dawn, apparently expecting to find me home and vulnerable to the urgent family meeting. Claire had demanded, "They were pounding on your door for 20 minutes, Grace. When you didn't answer, Derek went around to the back and tried to look through the windows. They were clearly agitated, and they kept checking their phones like they were waiting for calls or messages." Grace had watched the entire episode from her kitchen window, documenting the time and duration of their visit for potential use in legal proceedings. After Claire and Derek left, she had walked over to check my property for any signs of attempted break-in or vandalism. "Everything looks secure," she reported, "but there were footprints in the garden beds under your bedroom window, like someone had been trying to see inside or find another way into the house." The evidence that Derek had been attempting to gain unauthorized entry to my home was deeply disturbing. Combined with Marcus's attempted fraud and Claire's threatening phone call, it suggested that my children were willing to escalate their criminal activity, rather than accept my refusal to comply with their demands. Margaret used Grace's documentation to request emergency protection orders that would prevent my children from approaching my property or attempting to contact me through third parties. She also provided law enforcement with evidence that my children might be planning additional crimes, including potential breaking and entering or harassment of witnesses. "We're moving into the final phase of this situation," Margaret explained when she called with updates about the legal proceeding. "Law enforcement is ready to execute arrest warrants for Marcus and potentially Claire, but they want to coordinate the timing to ensure your safety and to prevent any evidence from being destroyed." The reality that my own children would soon be arrested for crimes committed against me was devastating in ways I struggled to articulate. I had moved beyond anger into a kind of emotional numbness, a protective detachment that allowed me to function while processing the complete destruction of my understanding of my family. The arrests happened on a Friday morning in early April. Margaret called to inform me that Marcus had been taken into custody at his Phoenix office on federal charges of elder fraud, identity theft, and attempted theft of assets. Claire was arrested simultaneously at her real estate office in Iowa on charges of conspiracy, harassment, and attempted breaking and entering. The FBI coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure both arrests happened at the same time, Margaret explained. They wanted to prevent either of them from warning the other or attempting to destroy evidence. The evidence recovered during the arrests included detailed financial records showing how my children had planned to access and distribute my assets, communications between Claire and Marcus, coordinating their pressure campaign, and copies of the fraudulent medical documents Marcus had used in his theft attempt. The scope of their criminal activity is actually larger than we initially realized, Margaret continued. They had detailed plans for liquidating your assets, purchasing property in both Iowa and Arizona, and distributing the proceeds between them. This wasn't a spontaneous crime, it was a carefully planned theft that they had been working on for months. The news that my children had developed detailed plans for stealing and distributing my assets was somehow more devastating than learning about their individual criminal acts. It meant that every conversation we had shared, every family gathering we had attended, every expression of concern they had offered, had been part of a calculated campaign to rob me of everything Frank had worked to provide. But the evidence also revealed something that provided a strange kind of comfort. Hidden among the documents seized during their arrests were communications showing that Claire and Marcus had convinced themselves they were acting in my best interests, that they were protecting me from my own poor judgment and inevitable decline. They created an entire narrative about rescuing you from a situation you couldn't handle on your own, Margaret explained. They genuinely believed they were being loving children, even while they were committing serious crimes against you. This psychological insight didn't excuse their criminal behavior, but it helped me understand how people I had raised with love and values had been able to justify such profound betrayal. They had rewritten our family story in ways that cast them as heroes and me as a victim who needed their intervention, even against my own wishes. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to resolve, but the immediate threat to my safety and autonomy was over. I was able to return to my home, secure in the knowledge that restraining orders and criminal charges would prevent my children from continuing their pressure campaign. The house felt different when I walked through the front door after my week at the hotel. It was still my home, still filled with memories and meaning, but it was also a place where I had been betrayed by the people I trusted most. The kitchen where Claire had spread brochures for senior living facilities, the living room where Derek had presented his financial analysis of my relocation options. These spaces would always carry the echo of their deception. But the house was also a symbol of my successful resistance to their manipulation. Frank's trust fund remained intact, controlled solely by me and protected by the legal safeguards he had established. My independence was secure, my autonomy was restored, and my future was mine to determine. The emotional healing would take much longer than the legal resolution. I grieved for the children I thought I had raised, for the family I thought we had been, for the relationships that had been destroyed by greed and entitlement. But I also discovered reserves of strength and resilience I hadn't known I possessed. Grace became my closest companion during the months that followed, helping me navigate the complex emotions of betrayal while rebuilding my confidence in my own judgment. Dr. Hoffman provided medical documentation confirming my continued mental competency, effectively refuting any lingering questions about my capacity for independent living. Margaret Henley became not just my attorney but my advocate, ensuring that my legal protections remained strong while helping me understand my rights and options. The criminal trials provided a kind of closure, though not the kind I had expected. Marcus pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and received a 3-year prison sentence along with substantial financial penalties. Claire accepted a plea agreement on state charges that included probation, community service, and restitution for the costs of my legal protection. Both of them wrote letters of apology as part of their plea agreements, letters that revealed their continued belief that they had been acting out of love and concern despite the criminal nature of their action. They expressed regret for their methods, while maintaining that their goals had been appropriate and necessary. I read their letters once and then filed them away with all the other documentation from this painful chapter of my life. Their apologies were too little and too late, tainted by their persistent refusal to acknowledge the fundamental violation of trust and autonomy their actions had represented. The financial impact of their crimes was ultimately minimal thanks to the protective measures Frank had established and Margaret had reinforced. The trust fund remained fully intact, my property was secure, and my monthly income was unaffected by their failed theft attempt. In purely practical terms, their elaborate criminal campaign had accomplished nothing except landing them in legal trouble, but the personal impact was profound and lasting. I had learned that family love could coexist with criminal behavior, that people could justify almost any action if they convinced themselves it was for someone else's good. I had discovered that independence and autonomy required constant vigilance, even against those who claimed to have my best interests at heart. I also learned that strength could emerge from the most devastating betrayals, that resilience could be found in the decision to protect oneself rather than enable others' destructive behavior. The woman who had been pressured to give up her home and independence was not the same woman who emerged from this experience with enhanced legal protections and unshakable resolve. 2 years later, I remain in my home on Maple Street, tending Frank's rose garden and living the life he intended the trust fund to provide. I volunteer at the food bank twice a week, attend book club regularly, and have developed new friendships with other women who understand the challenges of aging with dignity and independence. Claire and Marcus have both completed their legal obligations, but I have chosen not to resume contact with them. The restraining orders have expired, but the emotional boundaries I established during their criminal campaign remain firmly in place. They are welcome to rebuild their lives, but they are not welcome to be part of mine. Occasionally I receive indirect updates about their situations, through mutual friends or family members. Marcus has found new employment in Phoenix, and is reportedly working to rebuild his professional reputation. Claire has maintained her real estate career but struggles with the financial consequences of her legal trouble. Both are dealing with the long-term effects of their criminal convictions on their opportunities and relationships. I feel no satisfaction in their difficulties, but I also feel no obligation to provide assistance or forgiveness. They made their choices with full knowledge of the potential consequences, and they must live with the results of those choices, just as I must live with the results of their betrayal. The trust fund continues to provide the security and independence Frank intended, supporting a lifestyle that is comfortable, purposeful, and entirely under my own control. I make my own decisions about my daily routine, my living situation, my healthcare, and my financial affairs. No one questions my judgment, pressures me to make changes, or claims authority over my choices. This independence came at a cost I never expected to pay, the loss of my children, and the destruction of my understanding of my family. But it also brought gifts I never expected to receive, the knowledge that I could protect myself when necessary, the confidence that my judgment was sound even when challenged by those closest to me, and the peace that comes from living authentically according to my own values and preferences. Frank's greatest gift was not just the financial security he provided, but the legal framework he created to protect my autonomy. His foresight about the potential for family conflicts over inheritance proved tragically accurate, but his preparations ensured that my independence would survive even the most sophisticated attempts to undermine it. I think of him often as I sit in his old chair by the window, watching the sunset over the garden he planted for me decades ago. He couldn't have known exactly what challenges I would face, but he gave me the tools I needed to face them successfully. The trust fund was never just about money, it was about trust in both senses of the word. The woman I have become through this experience is not the same person who answered the phone that day when Southwest Financial Services called to report Marcus's fraud attempt. That woman was strong but untested, independent but vulnerable to manipulation, confident but unprepared for betrayal. The woman writing this story is stronger, more protected, and absolutely certain of her right to live her own life on her own terms. My children taught me that love without respect is manipulation, that family loyalty can become a weapon used against the vulnerable, and that the greatest betrayals often come from those who claim to be acting in our best interest. But I taught myself that it's never too late to protect what matters most, that independence is worth fighting for even when the battle costs everything you thought you had, and that true strength sometimes means standing alone rather than bending to others' expectations. The house on Maple Street remains my sanctuary, the trust fund continues to provide security, and my future stretches ahead, filled with possibilities I will choose for myself. This is the life Frank wanted me to have, the life I fought to preserve, and the life I will continue to protect with the same fierce determination that carried me through the darkest days of my children's betrayal. At 75, I have learned that wisdom sometimes comes at a terrible price, but that the knowledge gained through surviving betrayal can be more valuable than the innocence lost in the process. I am not the same woman I was before this ordeal began, but I am a better woman, stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain of my own worth. The trust fund will continue to support me for whatever years remain, managed according to my wishes and distributed according to my choice. When my time comes, whatever remains will go to carefully selected charities that support elderly independence and legal protections against elder abuse. My children will receive nothing, not out of vengeance, but out of justice. They have already taken everything from me they had any right to claim. This is my story, told in my own words, preserved in my own hand. It is the story of how I learned to save myself when the people who were supposed to protect me chose instead to prey upon me. It is the story of how trust funds are not just financial instruments, but declarations of independence, and how sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to stand alone, rather than compromise our dignity for the illusion of family harmony. The phone calls from unfamiliar numbers still make my heart skip a beat, but now I know how to protect myself. The trust fund remains secure, the house remains mine, and my future remains entirely under my own control. Frank's legacy lives on, not just in the assets he accumulated, but in the woman I became while defending them. I am Bertha Coleman, and I helped myself to what was rightfully mine, all along, my independence, my dignity, and my right to live my own life according to my own choices. No one will ever take those things from me again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.